Thank you for having me. All the way from Australia, as you said, thank you for that introduction. It's the only place, perhaps in the world, that you'll see a dingo eating a shark and two snakes hugging, all within the one picture. Am I right? Other Australians in the room? Where are you? So I don't want to brag. I hope you don't think this photo is a brag of our country. But I would, before I get started, I would like to acknowledge my professors that I work with, Professor Lee Waters, Professor Diane Vella-Broderick, Dr. Peggy Kern and Professor John Hattie, who have contributed to some of the research that I'll be presenting today. But first, I'd like to share a bit of a personal story of why I was interested, or why I became interested in school belonging. So we've looked through this conference at different spheres of belonging, global belonging, belonging in general. My work is very much focused on that sense of affiliation and sense of connection to school belonging. And so I first became interested in it when I was training for a hike at the Kokoda Trail, if you've heard of it, in Papua New Guinea. And I was doing a lot of walking at night time and to get fit, basically. Is it bumpy?
Otherwise you have to...
But I hold it.
Give it a shot.
Yeah. So I noticed during these nighttime walks that I was coming across a car that somebody was possibly living in because it was illuminated at nighttime. There was a light on. And one night I struck up the courage to tap on the window just to see if that person was okay. So they were obviously homeless and they were living in the car. And so, I chose night time. Sorry.
You need to put it on.
I need to put it on. Okay.
Yes.
It is awfully uncomfortable having it over my ears.
Yeah. Okay.
How's that? Better?
Yeah.
Is that better? Yeah. Okay. So I struck up the courage to tap on the window and thinking that the person that was going to respond was going to be extremely grateful that I had reached out and helped them. But I was met with this blood-curdling scream because I had frightened her. But the reason and purpose I'm telling you this story is because I had this opportunity to meet this amazing, intelligent, articulate woman who had fled domestic violence, was living in another state, and had relocated, living in her car, free from her husband and the problems he was causing, and free from the pressure of having to pay for housing, and was feeling quite empowered. And she had chosen to park her car not more than 100 metres away from her former school, which also happened to be the same school I was working at the time. So of course I was very interested in her story. And it had been 20 years since she attended this school, and yet she came back to this school, or this area where her school was, because she felt safest there, and she felt that sense of affiliation and belonging to her school, where she would literally put her hand on her heart to talk about her school. And it was that experience, together with talking with parents who had sent their children through the school, that would talk about the school with tears in their eyes. And it was also the experience of having students leave the school and come back to the school and keep visiting. I don't know if you have that experience in your schools. And then sometimes those students go off and study and they become a teacher themselves, and then they get to come back to the school in that way. So I wanted to capture what are the ingredients, what is the essence of that type of school belonging that is so powerful, so that it can be shared with all schools. And so that's where my interest in researching school belonging had started. So during our time together today, I wanted to talk about how we define school belonging and conceptualise it, because what it means for one person can mean something different for somebody else. So I think it's important to define. I wanted to talk about where belonging fits into the context of human development, because of course belonging changes across the lifespan, and in schools we have a really important role to shape how that belonging may look further down the track. I want to talk about why school belonging is so crucial for young people, and I hope to present some very compelling research based on that. And I want to talk about the challenges students face in the digital age, challenges that we all face, especially how we connect with each other. And then after I've talked about the troubles with belonging, I want to talk about the things that help enable us to belong, the enablers of belonging. And then I'll conclude with some key messages from the literature for practice, hopefully that you may be able to take away within your own schools. So to begin with some terminology. When we look at school belonging in the literature, it's referred to as any one of these terms: school bonding, school climate, notions of territory, school attachment, connectedness to school is a really big one. And even not belonging is also referred in the literature to multiple terms: alienated, ostracised, disengaged. So unpacking what that means from that research lens is really important to how we translate that research into the practice that we're putting into schools. There's also, just to complicate this area even more, there's a range of theories used to describe belonging that also fit to describe school belonging. So we have Maslow and Cohen and Bowlby and Putnam. And I guess one thread that I like a lot is Baumeister and Leary's the belongingness hypothesis, that talks about belonging as being an innate need, an innate drive that we are propelled to seek out with each other. And I feel that no matter what point of view that we're looking at, and we look at belonging from different perspectives, I think that there is an undercurrent and a general acceptance that we all feel that there is this general need to belong, that we all have that motivation. And even from that evolutionary perspective and that that mode of survival that we have, we know very early on that those people that we love and that connect us are also the ones that are going to feed us and keep us safe. We've also come to understand that school belonging is very multifaceted. And it's a complex construct, and it's born from a student's affiliation to their school. It's unique to the school and unique to each individual. And put simply, school belonging is about feeling connected to the school within a school social system. I'm just not going to move. I'm just going to... We also come to understand as belonging as inclusive and exclusive. And that draws on a little bit of the social identity theory. And if anybody's interested in reading about this more, I highly recommend you looking into Sue Roffey's work. But that idea of inclusive and exclusive has an impact on the individual level as well as the whole school level. So that's a very important lens to look at belonging through. So now I shared my school belonging story with you, and I'm sure you also have school belonging stories as well. What makes you interested in this topic? So I'm going to ask you, while I work out what to do with this microphone, to turn to the person behind you, because it's quite possible that you came with the person next to you. So go to the person behind you, and we'll have a couple of minutes to share your belonging stories with each other as a way to connect. Okay.
We have to switch it off.
Is it me?
No, it's just, I think it's the connections between it.
Although Jan was able to work it.
Try this one.
Is that something for your own sake?
That's somebody else gave me that.
Okay.
Oh yeah. I also felt really loud.
No. The opposite.
Oh, really?
The opposite. So that's why we have
discussions that I'm having. Okay. I can really see a lot of engaged discussions here. Nobody wants to stop. We've got a room full of teachers, and thank you to the person that clapped. Is that a thank you? So there's lots of discussions and lots of connections here, and I think that's really important part of a conference like this. So I hope that we can continue those discussions at lunchtime and throughout the conference. It's really important. So now I'd like to take a little bit of a step back and look at the picture of my beautiful baby who's now 4. Very much ingrained with us. It starts as soon as we are born. So first of all, we see that synchrony, that matching of behaviour, the matching of emotional states, the matching of behaviour, those biological rhythms, and we see that occurring between a baby and the mother and the father from very early on. We also see that, we obviously can't ask a baby what makes them connect and what makes them belong. So a lot of this research in this area is about observation. So we see smiling really early from 6 to 8 weeks. And then that also occurs, with strangers from about 12 weeks of age. So very much it starts off with those primary caregivers. We also, around this time, see those proto-conversations emerge. Now that's the reciprocal turn-taking of that verbal babble that we can do with our babies, that infants can do from very early on as well. And again, that's a part of connecting and belonging from very early. We see joint attention occurring. We see young children, young infants wanting to engage. We see that emerge. And from about 14 to 18 months, we see some of those cooperative behaviours, the dropping of things and wanting it to be picked up, or the picking up of things that have been dropped. But I guess possibly the most relevant aspect of belonging during this stage, and the most disturbing, is when we see belonging interrupted, when we see cases of trauma or neglect, or any kind of disturbance, parents being removed. We can see that having such a devastating effect on belonging and that developmental trajectory for a young child throughout their lifespan. So that's possibly the biggest part of the evidence that we see for the importance of belonging at that age group. Into early childhood, we see young children start to relate to their world around them. We see that egocentricity, that's all about me, and often we know, particularly for anybody with preschoolers or very young children, we see them really starting to test those boundaries. And often that's not about them, but it's about them in relation to others. It's about knowing that those boundaries are there to be tested, that are being imposed by others. So that's where the parents and the family and the caregivers become very important within the world of young children. Children in early childhood engage in behaviour that increases social interaction, conforms to social norms mostly, and demonstrates the development of social behaviour, social interaction and morals. And experimental research at this age group shows us that children interact, when they're placed in social situations, they generally seek to match the behaviours of others around them. except for when they're at a supermarket at 5 p.m. on a Friday night. They're not, they're not always seeking to match the behaviour of others around them. And that's about testing those boundaries. And again, removal of social interaction at this age can be quite distressing for children, as we know. When we look at childhood, we're looking more at young children beginning to connect with peers and connect with their teachers. And this is where schools become so important for the development of connecting with others and fostering that connection. It can be a time where students can struggle. So we can see children struggle when they don't have the development of those social skills. We can see children struggle when there may be some separation anxiety. They're separating from the parents and attending school. Childhood is characterised by a desire to be viewed positively by others and form those social bonds and manage a reputation. An important scientific evidence for this comes from some work by Engelman, who showed us that 5-year-olds still less and share more when they're in the company of others or they feel like they're being watched. So we also know at this age group, at around 5, we see that theory of mind develop. And I had a chance to talk about that yesterday, but for those that weren't there, theory of mind is the knowing the motivations, intentions and behaviour of others. Mind reading, if you like. There's the things that we do intuitively to know that perhaps you want to have this seat next to me or you wanted to talk to me at that time. And of course, again, prolonged exclusion at this age group can have a profound and detrimental effect on their physical and psychological well-being. Moving into adolescence, it's a time where there's a lot of change occurring. There's emotional maturity and more relationship development happening. And neural imaging research has shown us that adolescence is a time where the brain undergoes unique transformation and maturation involved in creating those complex social processes. Adolescence is characterised by things like identity formation. So that's a personal identity, but it's very much a social identity and where they fit into the world. And that's considered to be a very normative part of adolescence. We can see this age group shifting between different peer groups. And for some adolescents, that can be really stimulating and interesting, but for other adolescents, that can be very turbulent and distressing for them. For anybody that works with adolescents, you might know that. During adolescence, belonging is also important for that psychosocial adjustment. During adolescence, priorities change. So we see that moving away from the parents as primary social support to perhaps sharing some of those problems and troubles that adolescents face with their peers, who aren't always necessarily the best givers of advice, but we do see that shift away. And that's very important for that psychosocial adjustment. Another facet of adolescence is that transition into adulthood. And we know that connection is very important at facilitating a smooth transition in that respect. I guess a sense of belonging is more important during adolescence than any other age group. And that's because we know that adolescents have this heightened sense of exclusion and sensitivity to exclusion. And we also know that they're more negatively affected by things like social isolation and ostracism. So we know that adolescence is a really important time. And of course, negative experiences of belonging can have a profound effect, of course, down the developmental lifespan. Moving into adulthood, we see a transition period occur. We see people joining the workforce for the first time. We see people staying at home younger, young adults staying at home longer, not younger, than we have in decades past. And this is where we start to consider school belonging from the perspective of ourselves, as well as school staff, and as well as the adolescents that we're working with as they embark on that transition to adulthood. Many adults face young adults face difficulty with making and maintaining social contact. And we know from the research that that becomes more difficult for us once we're over the age of 26, which seems to be this figure that we've come up with that makes making friendships and connecting more difficult for us. For adults with young children, we see this period can sometimes be marked by an attrition in friendships as we juggle that push and pull of workplace demands and managing, the family. They can be all-consuming. Myself, I've got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I had this thought, maybe I'll take them with me to Denmark to this conference. And I had that tug of war inside me. Should they come? My professional self versus my mother self. I had that tug of war. But that first night in Copenhagen, when I had 12 hours continuous sleep in one go, I made the best decision to leave them at home. So that was very validating for me. Retrospective studies, so studies that have looked at adults and talked about their experiences of belonging when they were younger, as children and as adolescents, have shown that those that report social isolation or feelings of not belonging as children are more likely to have issues as adults down the track, so mental health concerns and psychosocial disturbances. So when we go into middle adulthood, there's less research in this age group, but we see this as an important time in respect to belonging as well. We see transition into retirement for some people, or we see relocation from different areas, different countries. And that uprooting and moving can also have a devastating effect on belonging because we're having to sort of replant ourselves in some ways. If we sort of imagine that we're a plant and we're pulling ourselves up from one area and we're embedding ourselves into another, we need time for those roots to grow and embed, and that takes time, and that can be quite disturbing for some people. In the UK, they've reported that the number of over 50s suffering from loneliness will reach 2 million by 2026. So that's some research that has come out of this age group that is quite concerning. Middle adulthood can be a time where there's threats to social connection, and they may tap into the same neural and physiological pathways as threats to harm, physical self and violence. So we know that the pain of not belonging can be really similar to the pain that we may experience from physical harm. So it's very much in our biology. Group life has become important, particularly in this age group, and social psychologist and legend, who I believe is just a really interesting researcher, Alex Haslam, tells us that joining groups and finding a sense of belonging is really core to our lives. We know that group life is linked to lifespan, is linked to increased lifespan and the prevention against infectious diseases. And Alex brings a lot of information to the world and to the public around this matter. He says that research shows that if you are over 50 and join one group today, your risk of depression will drop by 1/4. He also says if you have a history of depression and join 2 groups today, your risk of relapse will be halved by 4 years' time. So really important research to get out there to the general public, because this is a health concern on par with some of the other things that we sort of prioritise. During middle adulthood, we know that belonging to a group is a predictor of good health that is on par with diet and exercise. And we know this through meta-analysis through Holt Lunstead, who's done a lot of work in this area. Loneliness and social isolation has been found to be a health risk factor equal to smoking, obesity, heavy drinking and high blood pressure. So when we're going to our doctors, this really needs to be a part of the conversation, not just are you drinking, are you smoking? We need to be asking, are you involved in groups? Do you feel a sense of belonging? Are they meaningful to you? So this work is really important. Older adults it can be a very vulnerable time. We see limitations in physical ability and cognitive limitations that can prevent social interactions. Many older adults in residential care don't feel a sense of belonging to where they're living. And we see a loss of friendships through death in older adults, and loneliness has been identified as a major risk factor in this group along with adolescents. Research on belonging in this age group shows us that belonging to groups is linked to very interesting outcomes, such as greater resistance against stroke and getting a secondary stroke after you've received an initial stroke, increased memory by up to 10%, and a perceived meaning and purpose, a reason to live. So groups become very important in this age group as well. So we can see that belonging across the lifespan is important, particularly from our scope of looking at schools, because in some ways we have an opportunity to take a very preventative and proactive approach at demonstrating the importance of belonging for our young people, for their wellness, physically and psychologically across the lifespan. So we're in a really powerful place working with students. So bringing this back now to some of the benefits of belonging, what we know from the research is that school belonging and feeling a sense of affiliation to your school has been found to reduce the likelihood of mental health problems like depression and anxiety. It's been found to buffer these effects. It's found to promote resilience when mental health difficulties are experienced by youth that are considered at risk of suicide ideation or self-harm, and reduce suicidal thoughts and behaviour. We also know it's related to a bunch of outcomes that we're very invested in as people working in schools. We know it's related to high levels of emotional wellbeing, better academic performance and achievement, and good academic skills. One of my favourite researchers, Meredith O'Connor, who's based in Australia, looked at a very large data set and found that school bonding to school in adolescence was strongly related to 5 dimensions of positive development: social competence, life satisfaction, trust and tolerance to others, and civic engagement, engaging with your community as a productive social member. And she found that no other factor examined had such a strong and consistent relationship than school belonging. So this is really powerful evidence for why we should be invested in this, and it is terrific to see this a priority, and that this coming together from all these different countries and having this as a theme of a conference today is really important. We also know that school belonging has been negatively associated with many variables that aren't that helpful to receiving a good education and having a good time at school. So we know it's been shown to be related less to things like fighting, bullying, vandalism, absenteeism, school dropout rates, disruptive behaviour, substance and tobacco use, and violent behaviour. But possibly the most frightening of this is, what we're seeing in the US, and that's the scenario of school shootings. And some important research in this area has come from Wyke and Fraser, who found, very disturbingly, that shootings appear more likely in schools characterised by a high degree of social stratification, low bonding, and low attachment between teachers and students, and also fewer opportunities for school involvement. I think we can take lessons for that, even though that might not be an issue that we're facing. I think we can still take lessons away from that. In the research, high-risk school cultures were unresponsive to the individual needs of students, and I know that can be hard for teachers who have a lot under their umbrella, a lot in their role job description. Provided rewards and recognition for an elite few, and created social dynamics that promoted disrespectful behaviour, bullying and peer harassment, not fostering that sense of safety for students. In nearly all school shootings, perpetrators had low feelings of sense of belonging to school and to their teachers. And what we're facing at the moment is what some people are calling a loneliness epidemic, and whether or not it is an epidemic or whether we're pathologising or not, the data is there, and the data is very important, and it's across the globe. It's a global concern. An issue that's been so much concerned that you would have heard, you're a bit closer than me, but the UK has appointed a Minister for Loneliness. And back in Australia, we've developed the Australian Coalition to End Loneliness, which involves 20 not-for-profits and 10 universities. So this is becoming the fore and a priority across the globe. So in respect to loneliness prevention, I feel that school belonging and fostering sense of belonging is a response to that. So we have a responsibility to focus on belonging as a preventative aspect of addressing this big issue. And sure, some people will say they prefer to be on their own, but I'm reminded of this quote. Solitude is fine, but you need someone to tell you that, that solitude is fine for you. Because the vast majority of us have a need to connect and to belong with other people. So while we know belonging is good for us, for schools, we also know that there's less information on how that sense of affiliation to school can be fostered, and that's one of the things that I want to talk about today. And we also need to keep in mind that not in the too distant future, and this is a picture from Australia, that social isolation's been used as a punishment and consequence. And this is a photo taken from a penal colony in Port Arthur, and you can see that the seating is segregated. So, we know that isolation has been used as a punishment. So that's important to remember. Okay, so just a personal reflection now. And I think we've tapped on this morning in some ways, but just have a think about what created a sense of belonging for you to school. And if you didn't feel a sense of belonging to school, because some people didn't, what would you have longed for in that respect? So just have that in the back of your mind as I walk through these next few slides. What did you connect to at school? Because what we're seeing today compared to when we went to school is a shifting and changing landscape. And there's some uncertainty there. Those changes that we're seeing are at a social level. So they're hard for us as people working in schools to intervene. And yet we're often told that, we need to have responsibilities for, lots of responsibilities in terms of developing children. But, some of these challenges we're facing are beyond the school gates and in broader society. So we've seen a shift in things like family structure, living structure, neighbourhoods, less multi-generational families living together. As a society, we're becoming wealthier, so the way we're living is changing. We can live on our own, for instance. It's an option that perhaps decades past wasn't an option for people. There are changes to the way we connect with neighbours and knowing who is around us. There's also changes in the way we work, and as a consequence, parental roles and who's caring for the children are changing as well. There's increasing opportunities to work from home from anywhere in the world. And, in some ways, this allows us to have more interaction and time spent with family, but it also gives us more distractibility from our family. It's also preventing us from bonding and working with colleagues as well when we're working from home. So there's advantages and there's also challenges from that perspective. We've also become more mobile as a society, living across the world. And, again, that can have an effect on social bonds. We're not necessarily living with the people that we grew up with and went to school with, who we have those strong connections with. We're also looking at global challenges. We're living in such a fast-paced and moving society, and there's perhaps less time to connect. And for teachers, we know that they matter so much for belonging, but we're hearing from the research that they're not finding the time to connect with students. Now, that may be different for free schools, but if we're looking at other schools as well, we're finding that that they're running from A to B. Teachers are got a lot of stress and pressure on them, that they're having trouble to find that time to genuinely connect with their students. And the PISA data had some quite disturbing findings, and I'm going to read it out because it wasn't touched on last night for those that were able to join us. But in the PISA data, it showed that 35% of students reported that at least a few times per month their teacher called on them less than other students. They also reported that 21% of students said their teachers gave them the impression they were less intelligent than they were. 18% of students reported that their teachers grade them more harshly than others. 14% reported that their teachers discipline them more harshly than others. 10% reported their teachers ridicule them. 9% reported their teachers insulted them in front of others. Boys were more likely than girls to report that the teachers did not treat them fairly. I think that's important for us to know as educators. We know, particularly those that work with adolescents, that adolescents may not be the best informant. I was a school psychologist for 10 years and I've heard the way teenagers talk about their teachers. You know, they yell at me and, you know, sometimes they can be very black and white in their thinking. So we know that they may not be the best informant, but it is all about perception. And I think spending time building those relationships, we can start to begin to address some of those concerns that students are reporting. And last, we also are looking at a time of digital distraction, the rise of technology and the rise of screen time. And that's changing the way we connect with people. So in some ways it's allowing us to connect more, but in other ways it's making us be more separate. And this is not just a problem for young people, this is a problem for adults that we're facing as well. And what kind of impact, adults are having when they're on devices and screens around young children. We know that young children's screen habits are predicted by the use of screen time for adults as well. So if anybody's live tweeting, they're probably feeling a bit guilty or checking their mobile right now. I don't mean to do that. Have you heard of the phrase sharenting? Has anybody heard of sharenting? This is the term used to describe parents who are putting lots of images on their social media about their children and films, and they're on Instagram. That's the term used, sharenting. And, you know, that's interesting in its own right, because, you know, how we're viewing our children through a lens may have implications for how we connect and belong to our children. And one concern that I have as a psychologist is I worry about them learning those skills to be able to connect and belong themselves, and how that may change, you know, with the presence of digital distraction. So thinking back to what created that sense of belonging to you, or what you longed for, and the challenges that we face today as a society, just think about whether or not, you know, that they would have created a barrier to the way you connected, or whether it would have helped. You know, the sense of belonging for children today, for adolescents today, is different from when we grew up. So that's just something to think about. And we'll keep moving. So I'm going to discuss a little bit of my own research now, just to share with you. And I had told you about my motivation for my research, but I'd aimed to look at what themes influence school belonging in students, and how they compared. What was their impact? What was their effect size? So I did a technique called a meta-analysis, and this unreadable slide basically represents something like 26,000 hours of research, less time sleeping and watching The Bachelor. Do you have The Bachelor in Denmark? Yeah. You do? No, I joke. I started off with 588 papers, peer-reviewed papers, and through the process of elimination, I took it down to 45. I wanted to find the best papers in the area, best based on methodology, and the best in terms of what I was looking at. There needs to be a degree of sameness in what we're looking at, not in outcomes, but in the way that the research is presented. So I'm simplifying it a little bit. But it resulted in 98 cases, and together approximately 123,000 plus students involved. And what I found, these are my findings. So all themes that I found, except race and ethnicity and extracurricular activities, were significantly related to school belonging. Of the themes significantly related to school belonging, most had medium to large effect sizes. I don't know if I've got a laser, but you can see that in the right-hand column. I should note, before I do, I think this does demonstrate the importance of things like parent support, peer support, teacher support, motivation towards academics, I should note emotional stability is basically the absence of mental illness, absence of stress, anxiety and depression. And personal characteristics, I should also note, sort of is actually the social and emotional learning. That's what that picked up on, social and emotional competencies that we heard last night was going to be a priority of OECD. So we know that's really important. Teacher support had the largest effect size up the top of 0.46, showing things like trust and closeness to teachers, and social support and feeling valued and cared for by your teacher was very important. And that was followed by the personal characteristics. So that, we hear about the importance of social emotional learning and social emotional competencies in the curriculum. I guess this adds to the important evidence that suggests this is important for us to be looking at. Presenting findings visually, we were surprised, to be honest, to see that teacher support had a larger effect size compared to parent and peer support, particularly peer support, because, the literature, we think that, peers are more important, but teacher support had the strongest effect size, and also surprised that personal characteristics came in second. School belonging wasn't associated with school type, or what extracurricular activities and safe schools, students feeling safe in their school mattered. And my colleagues and I have conceptualised this using a bit of an ecological framework as a bit of a rainbow. And I won't go into it in very deep detail here, but we can see that there's multiple layers that affect school belonging. This is really to emphasise just how multifaceted it is. So, we've got the individual characteristics, we've got the different groups, we've got the school environment around it. And just like a rainbow, those systems aren't boxes, they blend together. When we look at a rainbow, those colours aren't distinct, they kind of blend. And we have low belonging at one end and high belonging at the other. And so children's sense of belonging falls across that spectrum. Belonging looks different for each individual, just like every single rainbow is different. So we found the rainbow metaphor to be really important for us. So how this looks in terms of implications, I've just got some thoughts I'd like to share for you, because we know that school belonging is a multi-systemic issue, and there's a few things that I see that are important. I think, and I am preaching to the converted. You come along to a conference on belonging, this is stuff that's in your heart already. But, schools around the globe and as a society, we need to prioritise belonging. We know that it's not a fluffy construct. We know that it's important. We know that it's underpinned by psychological, neuroscientific, medical research. We know cross-disciplinary how important it is. We know that obviously the academic side of school is important too, but I guess my point is that we shouldn't be doing one over the other, that we can do them together and both have a reciprocal benefit for each other. We know that when we focus on wellbeing and school belonging, that it has good academic outcomes as well. We need to consider the whole school environment. I think sometimes when we work with young people, it can become all about working with just the young people. But actually, school belonging is not just about the people we're working with, it's about ourselves and how we connect to the school. So it's school belonging for staff and for parents, how they connect to the school, and for school leaders as well. We need to think about it as a communal construct. So, while we're creating a sense of belonging to students, we need to create it as a sense of community as well. Our research shows that teachers matter the most, and we know that having that one adult outside of the family has been shown to buffer a whole range of negative effects and impact on young people. That student-teacher relationship shouldn't be undermined for how simple it is or how potentially naturally occurring it is. And if you're a school leader, you may ask yourselves, do your staff feel valued? Do they have the skills to connect with their students, and do they have time to create that connection as well? Because the evidence is clear: when school leadership focus focuses on school belonging for their teachers, they then are able to invest in that school belonging for their students as well. So we know that's important. And in the face of teacher burnout, teacher job stress, and teacher exhaustion, which has become a global concern, we know that this is important. And we also have to ask ourselves, are new teachers coming into the profession equipped with the skills to be able to connect with their students as well? And that's going to be an issue that we're going to be perhaps facing down the track. We need to share knowledge, and the conferences like today are a really important part of that. So what are some schools doing well that we can draw from and be inspired by? We need to include parents, and we've seen some really terrific examples of parents coming into the school community in Denmark, and I think that's something that you do particularly well. Because sometimes we see in other countries that parents and teachers can be at odds with each other in some way. So bringing them in and drawing on their expertise in the classroom can also be important. A colleague recently went to Bali, and she came back and told me the story that the local villagers had this hollowed out log called a kal, and when you blew on it, it was made of bamboo, it made this kal sound. And that in the middle of the village was signify that there was a community event happening, and that it would draw the community together, and it would signal community gatherings. And I think about this, and I think about how can we make schools, that kal of our community, how can they become the central hub of bringing the broader community in as well? We need to empower students, and we can do this by focusing on the way they think about school, think about their learning, think about the way they interact with their peers and teachers. There's modules that teach belonging that are out there on the internet that are free to download, that are good and reliable. So Mind Matters and Sensibility by Beyond Blue may be something that are interesting for you come out of Australia. And also I'm working on something that looks at a more socio-ecological approach to school belonging. We need to embed practices, because not all of this happens in the classroom, it happens outside of the classroom. So fostering school belonging shouldn't be an add-on, it's something that we need to embed. And we need to link that research as well to our practice. Now, time check, 5 minutes, okay. I'm just going to very quickly share three exciting pieces of practice for school belonging that's out there. First, Vivienne Paley, and if you have time, watch the Reject documentary that features her work. It's very interesting. But she's an early childhood educator that basically divides the rule, you can't say you can't play, and has started it off in preschool settings. And there's been researchers that have evaluated this, that have shown that really helps with inclusion and that sense of belonging from the early years. The other exciting piece of research that's emerging at the moment is Greg Walton. Now, he's at Stanford University, and he's looking at research that involves getting older students to talk to younger students about how they fit in and their sense of belonging, the challenges that the older students faced. And the results have been startling. It's not only shown that these younger students attribute that transition periods as normative, but it's showing that they're going to the doctor less, so physical health benefits. It's showing that they have a greater sense of belonging and greater academic achievement. And these findings have been long lasting. So when he's evaluated them 6 months and 12 months down the track, they're having a lasting impact. So his work is interesting and something we can take away and apply straight away. The other thing, the last thing that I wanted to talk about was the Act, Belong, Commit campaign. Could you please put your hand up if you've heard of this? Because it's in Denmark now. So it emerged as a mental health promotion campaign in Western Australia, and now it's come over to Denmark, and it's basically a campaign that informs the community to be active physically and mentally, to belong to groups, and to do things with a greater meaning and purpose. It's a social message. I have no idea what this says, and I have no idea what this says. But belonging is everybody's business. So we need to not necessarily love our neighbour, but we need to know our neighbour, And to do that, I'd just like to very briefly introduce, with the 5 seconds I've got remaining, that in your satchels, your conference show bags, you have a belonging bingo. And I've got 2 prizes actually, a first prize and a second prize. So anybody that is able to fill out the squares, does everybody know what human bingo is? Yes. So the first person and the second person to fill out the prizes, the squares, can win a prize, which is a book by me and my colleagues as well. And to end, hungry students think of food, lonely students look for friends. So we need to think about, where we want students to invest their energy. And that's all.